The happy end of a term life policy is that you don't get a payout, right? Most people who get term life, they live. And that's good because you lived. The fundamental idea, right, is none of us knows when we're going to die. But when you like have 1,000 people, you can start getting some statistical regularity on like who's going to die. That some number of us are going to die. So if 1,000 people all put $1 in a pot and one person's going to die this year, then they get $1,000, right? And that sort of like makes sense. There's real protection and risk sharing. But for those 999 people in that example, they put $1 in the pot, but it could feel like they didn't get anything. And they did get something. They got the protection, but it may feel that way. And we just think that there's not a great history in Bitcoin or crypto of promising something and then people feeling that they didn't get anything. So we like to stick with products where like we're making promises and guarantees where we can like definitively show that like we are meeting these promises and guarantees. And like there's never a question ever about whether we've met a promise and a guarantee.
And I guess, Zach, on the promise and guarantee, you're mentioning thousands of Bitcoin sometimes by customers. If you were...
Sorry, we have a policy max. You can't give us more than like 30 or 40 Bitcoin.
Okay, so 30 or 40 Bitcoin, which is still a significant amount of money.
It's still a lot. It's still a lot. But yeah, we have had people ask us if they can pay 1,000 Bitcoin. The problem is if that guy dies, so we very prudently manage our risks by having policy limits.
Now, my next question is, what type of visibility does a policy holder have into the company and the audits?
The audits are public, actually. So if you go to our website, right up, it's like one of the main things on the website is the financials. And you can see like my CEO letter, you can see the external auditor, you can like absolutely see our financials. Our current audited financials are from last year. And you can see at the time, the end of last year, we had something like 250 Bitcoin in assets. And we've actually more than doubled since then. The next time people will see that is in our 2025 audit, which will be released in early 2026.
And what is one of the biggest questions that you get when people are trying to sign up that's more like a hurdle for you guys as a Bitcoin insurance provider?
Yeah, look, I mean, fundamentally, I joke that we sort of do a lot of things that are not beloved in Bitcoin land, right? Like, one, you send us your Bitcoin. Nobody likes doing that. Two, we manage your Bitcoin and everyone else's in a giant pile, right? So there's like a hypothecation. The third is we lend Bitcoin to get yield, right? So we have reasons for all of those things, right? And fundamentally, the reason we do all of these things is not just because we want to build a great company, but it's actually how we comply with all these tax rules and stuff. So like I have a lot of lawyers and like we have tax opinions about this is in fact life insurance and it will in fact get these tax protections. So the number one question people ask us is like, why should we trust you? And then what I'd say is that it's all these things adding up together. It's that I'm not anonymous. It's that we have people, like we just closed a policy, I think maybe yesterday, that someone who first came to the website and signed up 18 months ago, or like right when we started. So we see that having the external audit published, like we've raised a Series A from a $40 million Series A from Folger, who is like a well-known Bitcoin fund, and Wences, who's like a well-known Bitcoin OG, right? I come on podcasts like this and answer questions. We talk, every single person who comes and signs up on our website, someone on my team or we have a Zoom call with them and we answer every question they have, right? These things add up over time to people trusting us more. But we know it's a big ask. That's why people don't do it. But we are fortunate that, again, users have trusted us with now many hundreds of Bitcoin, and trust is something you earn. And one of the way you earn it is like, we just do exactly what we say we're going to do. And that's been working out for us.
And that's amazing. I mean, that's the goal of, to your point, building the Bitcoin economy. You have to sniff out, okay, what is the legitimacy of each one of these groups? And I definitely see that you guys come off as a legitimate Bitcoin company based on all the reasons you've already listed. When it comes to people building in the intersection of legacy finance and the Bitcoin economy, what advice do you have to other entrepreneurs other than what you mentioned about staying to your word and being trustworthy and being visible? Yeah. When it comes to building in that intersection of the old world versus the new Bitcoin world?
Well, I think the biggest difference is that in the new Bitcoin world, one, transactions being somewhat irreversible, it requires that you are more trustworthy. And I think the second is that there's obviously a history of frauds and Ponzi schemes, right? So I really place myself with, as you say, there's a cohort of people who I think who are really building the Bitcoin economy at the intersection of Bitcoin and regulated financial services. And I think sometimes you'll notice that things might be a little slower. They might be a little less flashy. They might, in our case, we spent a year getting a sandbox license, then another 9 months until we launched, and another year until we got fully licensed. And that was really, man, was that hard. But if you're going to do something complicated and difficult, I think you have to do it the right way. And I look at, these aren't necessarily all Bitcoin companies. I look at an Anchorage, or even I think Coinbase over and over again made the choice to be a little more buttoned up. And I think that's the right choice. But again, Anchorage becoming an OCC regulated trust company, I don't know, even there are a lot of, I think, people doing the right things, but I think the right things can often be frustrating as an entrepreneur because it also means you probably go a little slower. And I think that's certainly the right trade-off for us. But I think actually in general, that's the right trade-off when you're building an entire new economic system in an entire new currency.
Exactly. You don't want to mess up. You don't want to become the Mt. Gox or an FTX. You want to do it right, as you're mentioning. And there's plenty of protocols and players that have done it right, that have published those, that show you the regulatory framework to work in. So I think that's great advice. And one of the questions I have is about, you want to serve 1 billion people. So what's the roadmap to get there? You mentioned people coming to websites, signing up, even if they're not in one of those countries that you currently serve. But how do you get to 1 billion people through Meanwhile?
Yeah, I mean, fundamentally, we believe this is a once in a century opportunity to build a competitive long-term savings company, because we are right at the emergence of an entire new economic system. The analogy I use is probably the only top 10 global life insurer that was founded in the last 50 years is a company called Ping An, which is the life insurance company in China. And they were founded in the 90s, and they rode the wave of that country growing. And I think we want to ride the same wave, Bitcoin penetrating the global economy. So I think there's three things. One is, first and foremost, what we've talked about, which is our core number one value is to meet our commitments, to be trustworthy, to do exactly what we say we're going to do. And by the way, that's just unusual. Actually, I remember when we were raising our Series A and we went to a bunch of VCs that I had talked to about the seed, or I'd talked to previously. And they were just oh, you did exactly what you said you were going to do. That's really unusual. That's our number one North Star of how to grow, is to meet our commitments. The second is we have a theory from the very, very first memo we wrote around the company, we sort of use the analogy of Tesla, which is we were going to build a roadster. And our product right now, just to be honest, it's a roadster, right? It's basically for, at least globally, right, high net worth or ultra high net worth individuals, primarily for protection and tax planning. But we want, in time, as we build more of a balance sheet, as we build more technology, to systematically move down market. And that's both with new products like we talked about, and then also in being able to profitably serve smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller sizes. Whatever that will eventually be, our current policy minimum is 1 Bitcoin. It's a lot of money. I always get the orders of magnitude. Our policy minimum is 1 Bitcoin total, which will look like a tenth of a Bitcoin a year. But still, that's a lot of money. Actually, we're about to lower that, because when we set the limit, Bitcoin was at 30,000. So obviously dollars. But in time, we want to start thinking about policies in terms of hundreds of thousands of Satoshis, maybe, which is much smaller. And that's building up technical infrastructure. That's building up regulatory infrastructure. So that's our plan, is we have this product. It's primarily for high net worth individuals. And then we sort of systematically get lower and lower, and can serve people all over the world, digitally and globally. Yep. So meet our commitments, and then sort of systematically move down market. And then the third thing I already said, which is ride the wave of Bitcoinization. We don't see ourselves as actually being in the business of convincing people to buy Bitcoin. We see that as like, that's the thing that happens in the world. And that is the thing that's going to increasingly happen in the world. And yes, maybe that you can have disagreements about whether the ETFs are good, but I think that BlackRock saying that 1% of your retirement savings should be in Bitcoin makes a lot of sense. And that's good in the world. And we don't think that convincing is our job. We think our job is to support and help the people who've already made the decision to partially or wholly live their life in Bitcoin. And we think that'll be more people every year. And eventually, yes, it'll be 1 billion people in the world who have some interest and exposure and investment in Bitcoin. And then they're going to want a partner who will help them with long-term savings.
I think, Zach, that's like something the Bitcoiners in the world need. So thank you so much for like developing that and bringing this to market, because it is so important to think about this global reserve currency that we're building and the ability to have it passed on without being taxed to a wazoo, even though that's not the normal term.
The technical term. The wazoo. Yeah.
One of the questions I had as you were mentioning the smaller amounts, when you have a client who, let's say something happens in their life, let's say they didn't die, but they got disabled and they can't make one of those monthly or those annual premium payments in Bitcoin, or if the price appreciates too quickly, how do you guys work with someone on that?
Yeah. Look, my personal advice is never be short Bitcoin. Don't buy a policy that is bigger than your stack. We do have some more I'd say TradFi users who have bought a policy bigger than their stack because they're like, oh, this will force me to dollar cost average into Bitcoin. Again, personally, I wouldn't do that. So almost all of our users, maybe they have a Bitcoin, they buy a policy, or they have 5 Bitcoin and they buy a 2 Bitcoin policy, or they have 500 Bitcoin, if you're so fortunate, and they buy a 30 Bitcoin policy. But we don't really suggest that you go beyond your current stack, even if you're only paying us once a year.